So, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to you also from me, the moderator. I have to apologize for these two unforeseen losses. One of them is my voice, so sorry for that. And the other one is that we have become an all-female panel since we have lost András, who is in Ukraine now and is encountering problems with the internet and cannot join us. But we have wonderful experts who have already been introduced to us. And our topic today, as of what does it take to win, insights and lessons from Russia's war in Ukraine, could not be any more actual than it is today on the 938th day of the full-scale invasion. So, on that note, first of all, I will turn to Ms. Amanda Pohl, who is the Senior Policy Analyst and Deputy Head of the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Center. How do you see, what are the potential obstacles and opportunities for negotiated settlement to the conflict? How should we see the roles? What role can the international diplomacy and community play in all this? How do you see this?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and also for the EPC being a partner in this panel. This is a very good question. For the time being, I see many obstacles and zero opportunities for any sort of negotiated settlement. I think that it's very futile at the moment to think we're anywhere near that point. I mean, there's many, let's say, analysis out there or messaging saying it's time to end the war, it's time to have a settlement. And of course, nobody wants an end to this war more than Ukraine. But the situation on the ground simply isn't viable for this. So Ukraine certainly shouldn't be pushed into any sort of settlement. Ukraine shouldn't and won't engage in negotiations without having a significant advantage on the battlefield. This is not currently the case. If they don't have that advantage on the battlefield, if they are forced into some sort of settlement, it'll just be used at some time in the future for Russia to regroup and re-invade Ukraine again. We've seen this throughout Russian history, so it's not a new analysis. And why are we in this situation? I think everybody in this room perhaps knows that, because Ukraine's partners have not delivered what they should have to Ukraine in terms of weapons and in terms of the speed of those weapons. They have been drip-fed right from the beginning and continue to be dispersed in that way. And as we've seen from the news over the last weeks and days, there's still the ongoing debate over whether Western missile systems can be used to strike deep inside of Russia. The famous ATACMS and Storm Shadow. One can hope there will be a positive result to this in the next weeks or around the US presidential elections. We seem to be getting to that point, but we aren't there yet. And the unfortunate situation has left Ukraine in a very vulnerable situation. We can see every day that the Russians are purposely striking Ukraine's energy infrastructure and other types of infrastructure and civilians. So this is definitely not a situation where you would start negotiations from. Ukraine needs to have the maximum amount of leverage it can to get the best and sustainable outcome, and most importantly, a just outcome. And this means having sustainable and strong security guarantees, whether that's NATO membership or whether it's bilateral arrangements that are actually binding. I mean, Ukraine has been signed many bilateral security agreements, but most of these are not binding. So it needs some strong form of security agreement and deterrence. Now, if we look to the Russians, I mean, the Russians aren't interested in a settlement for the moment, and why would they be? I mean, their military may be weak, etc., but at the same time, they're using the current failure of the West to deliver arms to Ukraine to continue to drive forward and do what they can in order for themselves to end up with a, let's say, a more a more powerful outcome. And President Putin hasn't moved away from his original goal. I mean, the original goal of Putin was to wipe Ukraine off the map. And let's be clear, this is still the case. So I think we're still far from a point where we can actually sit down and have a conversation. And just to come to the second part of your question, of course, international diplomacy is very important and has already played an important role. I mean, we've seen some attempts right at the beginning. There was the negotiations in Istanbul, which many people thought would deliver a result. It didn't. And there have been other efforts. But again, at the moment, I think that all of these efforts are going to be in vain as long as Ukraine isn't in a strong position on the battlefield. And also it very much depends on which countries are going to be engaged. At least in my opinion, this isn't just about European or the United States sitting at the table. I think there'll also have to be representatives from the global south. I mean, those countries that do have leverage on Russia. So it's going to be, let's say, a more diverse group of countries involved in an eventual settlement. In my opinion, I think at least for the short term, the most important thing is to continue to have these other sorts of, I wouldn't call them negotiations, vis-a-vis specific issues. For example, the key role that Turkey had played on the grain initiative, the key role that Qatar has played in conversations with both on the return of POWs. These are very important because it's possible to make traction on very specific issues, which can have an important role in the final settlement. And of course, from a Ukrainian perspective, the final settlement should be based around President Zelensky's peace formula. I guess everybody is familiar with that.
Thank you. At the beginning of your answer, you have mentioned that Ukraine under no circumstances should be pushed to any unfavorable solution. Now I'm turning to Ms. Olha Opalenko, who is head of evidence at the Truth Hounds in Ukraine. And my question to you is related to this. How do you see, how is Russia using disinformation and propaganda to undermine the international support for Ukraine? Because unfortunately, these two things are related.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here. So I think I'm representative of more like practical side here. So I will use my notes because I can speak endlessly using statistics. So I am very bad in these geopolitical things. But still, yes, Russia is widely using disinformation, using different various media channels, making extensive use of social media, and is really extremely active in creating an enemy image, portraying Ukraine and its partners as threatening or aggressive forces to justify its actions and mobilize the population within its country. Needs further may be proved, but it is undoubtedly that thanks to total, comprehensive, shameless propaganda that the war in Ukraine became possible. Unprecedented, with numerous victims of all ages, with the most brutal crimes, torture, sexual violence, murder, including executions. Russia's top leadership devotes enormous resources to funding propaganda media machine that spreads lie around the world. Europe, America, Africa, Asia, all over around the world. Is it possible to measure the impact of propaganda on the commission of crimes? Perhaps it was harder in the past, but with glaring historical examples, we cannot remain neutral. It is not the propaganda itself, but criminal neutrality that leads to numerous horrific consequences. The technical nature of and the possibilities of working with digital evidences now create a high-quality basis for such researches, and we are confident in our capabilities and serious in our intentions to prove the intentional actions of the top leadership of the Russia Federation. In our work, we operate with resources that allow us to carry out such study. On daily basis, we monitor media related to the war, we use OSINT investigations and document in the fields. Among other things, we're doing this to counteract propaganda. We use different databases that allows us to store and verify literally every piece of evidence and duplicate these databases multiple times to prevent their destruction by different types of potential attacks. That's why we believe in justice and ready to wait for it, but patiently, and actively at the same time. For example, our reports, investigations, studies, such as maybe you've heard about the Kakhovka Dam studies, Zaporizhia Atomic Station study, are detailed evidence-based products that, among other things, refute Russia's propaganda statements. Unfortunately, although the use of facts and evidences is a powerful strategy in the scientific and research field, we need a more vigilant and consciousness attitude on the part of governments and key actors in democratic countries to foster a healthy skepticism in societies. We are naturally thinking of propaganda as a phenomenon that actively and aggressively influences people's mind by bombarding them with false and sometimes even absurd messages, which are undoubtedly true, but only part of a whole picture. The propaganda machine also uses passive mechanisms that lull attention and gently divert it away from the truly incredible, terrible, inhuman crimes against humanity that are taking place right now on the territory of Ukraine, a country that rapidly developing democracy and fighting for the future of other democracies. Thank you.
Talking about development, now I'm turning to Ms. Oleksandra Azarkhina, the former Deputy Minister for Communities, Territories and Infrastructure Development until the April of 2024. How would you assess how effective has international humanitarian and military aid been given to Ukraine? How effective has it been? How would you address this?
Thank you very much for the question and the great panel. So I would try to refer to the previous speakers as well. So first of all, for sure, I cannot blame none of our partners for not delivering in time, but for sure it's quite comparison. If we look into defense production of allies countries, Ukraine itself, and the Russia and so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse, because we need to understand that Russia acts not alone, and we need to look into the China, into the North Korea, into Iran. And for sure, there are a lot of things to do in terms just being more pragmatic and just to calculate to make sure that Ukraine can be in a better place from the front line, which is all about the defense industries right now. The good news that Ukrainian defense industries are doing well, and maybe we need to focus now more on the Ukrainian production. For now, Ukraine isn't EU member yet, and we are in the martial law, which allows our producers to be way faster, to be way innovative. And as you know, we are doing by learning, and for sure that's the only way we can survive through this war. Many of the solutions we are implementing, they are far from the things which are only dependent on the humanitarian or military aid, but it's actually just, hard work of the people who are fighting, but they have lack of the access to the finances. So those things are very, very basic. The other thing I really would like to refer regarding this overall approach on the negotiations. Of course, it's a tricky question, but I would like to remind one of the cases we had in our team back in the ministry. It's exactly about Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I do believe one of the lessons learned from there, it's about the way it was structured. It was structured in a way when Ukraine hadn't negotiation with Russia. Ukraine wasn't signing anything with Russia, but that was the mirror agreements between Ukraine, Turkey, and UN, and from the other side, the same agreement between UN, Turkey, and Russia. So I do believe that when we are still fighting, that can be one of the ways, one of the formulas to do the same. Another thing where I do believe we have challenges. Yes, time matters. We know exactly how the military logistics works. We know how we all depend on the such things, plus energy situation. We all need to look now into November, frankly speaking. That's a timing when the winter actually coming to Ukraine, and that will be quite a tricky moment when most of the Ukrainian population will be under the danger to have the no electricity or heat for some period of times. So that's the questions of our forecasting. What can we do? We can be more focused on the air defense. And here I do believe we have a small chance not only to rely on the new deliveries, but also to use more capabilities from the allies countries and to start talking and practically calculating the air defense shield, which can be not only Ukrainian own air defense system, but also operations from the allies over Ukrainian territory. Thank you.
Thank you. Talking about lessons learned now during to this poll, how would you assess which factors have contributed to Ukraine's resilience to all this Russian aggression? And what do you think, what can we learn from it? And can this experience inform future conflict prevention?
This is also a very good question. Ukrainians are very resilient, but of course this didn't just start from this big war. Let's remember this war began in 2014, and I think basically even earlier than that, when we go back to Maidan and before that, Ukrainians and particularly Ukrainian civil society that were the sort of driving forces of the Orange Revolution and then Euromaidan. I think these actors have played a strong role in reinforcing the resilience of the population in the country, and we've seen that grow extensively over the last decade or more. But you're right, I mean, since the full-scale war, the actual level of resilience has been incredible. I've never seen anything like that before in my life, and I'm sure there's many lessons that can be drawn from it. But again, in 2014, we saw a strong level of resilience, a strong mobilization of civil society and of our grassroots actors on the ground, which have had an impact, I think, on, let's say, ordinary folk, ordinary people, and making them more resilient. And this has been really, let's say, a really important factor in this war, in actually being able to respond to this war. And I want to say this about Ukrainian civil society in particular, because since the first days of the big war, civil society and of our grassroots actors have played a key role in basically holding the country together in many different ways that I'm sure my two colleagues here are much more experienced to even explain better. And this is really a sign of how resilient the country has become, and without the resilience that these folk have, I don't think Ukraine would be in such a robust position that it is today.
As your organization and you yourself focus on documenting and investigating Russian war crimes, how have these Russian war crimes in Ukraine affected the Ukrainian society? So, I mean, my question would be related to how have these war crimes which were committed affected the society in a long-term way, and how does it affect the long-term prospects of peace and reconciliation in the future?
Yes, thank you. That's true. In our organization, Truth Hounds, we've been documenting war crimes since 2014. And from the beginning of large-scale invasion, we are doing this in a strong connection with regional prosecutor institutions, General Prosecutor Office, and International Criminal Court, of course, in a strong and deep communication with them. So first of all, I would like to say that these crimes are, what are these crimes? So basically, these are torture, detainees, sexual violence, unlawful arrest, detention, attacks on civilians' infrastructure, abduction, finally mass killings, systematic killings of civilians, ethnic cleansing, we can say even about this, meaning forced displacement of the population from the occupied territories. So these crimes have had a profound impact on Ukrainian society, causing serious consequences, first and foremost for the victims of these crimes and of course their families, causing psychological trauma first of all, and all the cascading effects they have on social disintegration and increased tension in our society. So that society has been subjected to practically to a psychological shock, because each day we see mass killings, we hear about torture, we see daily shelling of civilian infrastructure, and this causing deep emotional trauma to all of us. So this causes collective fear, grief, despair, especially among those who witnessed or were the victims of the war. But today we must recognize that we are talking about practically 100% of the population of Ukraine. Along with strengthening patriotism and political mobilization in the context of my profession, I want to emphasize the valuable intensification of human rights initiatives in Ukraine. Over the past 10 years, society has become much more aware of human rights, and numerous new initiatives are still emerging to collect evidences and document crimes in Ukraine. In our work, we devote a full day each week exclusively to sharing our experience so that the field of documentation grows and develops, creating a solid foundation for archiving justice and peace, no matter how long it will take. War crimes in Ukraine have had a significant impact on the long-term prospects for peace and reconciliation. They have caused deep distrust between the parties to the conflict. Unfortunately, we cannot talk about even the beginnings of a dialogue or a cooperation, of course, but we hope that the efforts being made to document the crimes in detail will contribute to the restoration of justice, and thus, in the long run, will be the beginning of a dialogue process. The mere existence of war crimes requires investigations and prosecutions which can form the basis of justice. However, the absence of punishment, and we all know that these processes take an extremely long time, can lead to a sense of hopelessness and initiate further rounds of aggression. The trauma caused by crimes can be passed down from generation to generation also, making reconciliation and reintegration processes much more difficult. This is especially important for Ukraine, where almost every generation of Ukrainians has suffered from the criminal actions of Russian Federation and Soviet Union. Therefore, achieving peace will require a comprehensive approach, including restoring trust, justice, and support for victims. Thank you.
As the damage done to the infrastructure was mentioned, my next question would be to Ms. Azarkhina. Given your background in infrastructure development, how do you see which are the major challenges and opportunities for rebuilding the critical infrastructure and to restore the economic activity in the most affected regions? How should we look at all this?
So for sure, the main, challenge is still ongoing war, and is definitely something which we are facing since the day one. But one of the sources of Ukraine resilience, it's exactly the decision which we took, without asking each other on the whole level of the society, that we need to have a rebuilding process as a part of our resilience. So the reconstruction of Ukraine is a process which, frankly speaking, started with the war itself. Plus, we talking on this process, it's quite, unique if we compare with the reconstruction processes all over the world in the different periods, because it's happening on a very decentralized basis from both sides. So we have multiple actors on Ukrainian side, but also a lot of the donors, partners, investors from the partner side. It started to happen all together without the, unique, very well organized planning, and there is a beauty in that. At the same time, we do understand that when we still have not this stage when there's already a lot of the resources, it's very hard to do substantial things which can power our economic growth as well. So all those things, they're more about the answer on the challenges which are happening daily. And for sure, again, energy. We started when the war started, it was 36 gigawatts of the energy produced internally inside Ukraine. Now, with all the destruction, temporarily occupied territories, we have 9. So it's like a huge damage, huge losses. And for sure, that's something which we can rebuild in a better way. And we do hope it's also the chance for our decentralized energy generation, but still just a huge challenge for our industries, for our cities. And again, I keep saying about that Russia are looking on that not only as a humanitarian crisis inside Ukraine. Russia will push this as a possible refugee crisis in Europe. And we know exactly how Russians used them back in 2016 after Aleppo, when the problem started to happen in political circles in Europe with the crisis of refugees from Syria, because partners failed Syria with the air defense, and that's how we all happen to have much more things with the conservatives' moves inside the Europe and even America.
Talking about the implications for Europe and European security, Ms. Paul, I'm turning to you. How do you see, which are the long-term implications? I mean, the key long-term implications for European security architecture and for the global world order of this war?
I mean, that depends on whether we see a Russian defeat or a Russian victory. If we see a Russian victory, I mean, starting from the point that Ukraine may not exist anymore after that sort of victory, for Europe, it will certainly undermine European security, to say the least. It will completely destroy the rule-based international order, thereby empowering a new sort of international order, encouraging other countries to follow suit. To use aggression as a way of achieving strategic objectives. I'm not going to name any specific countries, but I think we all know who they could be. I mean, many of those countries are the ones that have stayed neutral in the current scenario, because these countries, despite saying they support Ukraine's territorial integrity, don't go much further than that. They would be, quite happy to see the Russians win to some extent, so that it would change the international order in the world. It would also, I would say, let's say, increase the intensity to which we're now seeing middle powers rise. I mean, countries like India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and some others that are no longer just, regional players. They're much more than that. It would give them a bigger say in world affairs. So I think a lot would be at stake here. It goes far beyond Ukraine, but Ukraine is the biggest stake here. So our future as democracies really does depend on how the war ends, which is why it's important that Ukraine continues to get the support it needs, and that there's a final settlement that is sustainable and just, so that Russia will never attempt to carry out such an act again, and that neither will any other country who has these sort of intentions.
Closely related to that, Ms. Opalenko, how do you see, how are we going to hold the perpetrators of war crimes accountable? So how are we going to contribute to this to never happen again? How do you see, which international institutions should play a role, and how should they do that? How should we approach this?
Thank you. Well, even though there are multiple problems within this process of achieving accountability, and I would say even that today we have a global crisis in a humanitarian, international humanitarian law, still without doubt that international institutions play a very important role in holding perpetrators, doing documentation, investigation, support national legal system, doing sanctions, ensuring justice and fairness, and etc. Basically, United Nations system, International Criminal Court can collect and analyze evidences of war crimes and everything, and Ukrainian civil society and human rights organizations are guided by the highest standards of documentation and now proactively cooperate with the above-mentioned institutions. And yesterday, today, and I hope in the future it's going to be like this. And international institutions can conduct independent investigations and initiate legal proceeding, providing a legal basis for bringing perpetrators to justice. In this regard, we are most actively cooperating now with foreign prosecutors under the universal jurisdiction method. International institutions can assist Ukraine in strengthening national judicial system by providing technical assistance and giving experts maybe to investigate war crimes. They can actively contribute to the process of sanctions, imposing sanctions on individuals and everything like that. But finally, they can act as mediators in peace of negotiations, calling for reconciliation and fair reparation for victims. For instance, in Ukraine, a pilot project to provide interim reparations to victims of serious war crimes is currently being successfully almost completed, thanks to the efforts of Truth Hounds and Global Survivors Fund with the support of the Ukrainian government and foreign investments. Thanks to this project, the victims receive monetary compensations, the government has a ready-made framework for future work, and the prosecutor's office and the ICC have the opportunity to cooperate to achieve justice. The project makes extensive use of Truth Hound's tools and expertise. Thanks to the accumulated amount of information, we are able to verify information without the need for additional trauma to the victims. To summarize, these actions can help to strengthen the international legal order and demonstrate that those responsible for war crimes will be punished, which in turn can serve as a deterrent to further crimes. It is widely known that these mechanisms have certain limitations. Well, first of all, many countries are unwilling to cooperate within these international institutions, within this international mechanism with international institutions, which significantly complicates the above-mentioned processes. International courts have limited jurisdiction, which makes it difficult to prosecute perpetrators. The war is ongoing, and most witnesses are in danger or not yet ready to testify. Perhaps the most challenging aspect is that the most trials can take years to complete, leading to frustration for many, many victims. We face this basically on a daily basis. Along with limited funding and politicization, all of this has a significant impact on the effectiveness of international mechanisms, unfortunately.
Broadening the role of international partners. Ms. Azarkhina, how do you see, which are the key priorities for Ukraine's long-term development and security following the end of the war? And how can the international partners continue to support these efforts and continue to support these efforts the best?
Thank you very much for the question. So after the government, not a surprising thing, we as a team, we established a think tank, and the naming of the think tank is We Build Ukraine. So we exactly decided to find an answer for your question. So we're looking into the questions where we need to focus to make sure that Ukrainian economic can grow, and how can we prioritize the investment, both public, but more importantly, private investments, to drive the most important economic sectors. Because many things changed, and I already mentioned the increasing growth of Ukrainian defense industry, and really just like anyone who know even a bit about it could tell the successful stories which are not comparable with anywhere in the world. But other sectors like Ukraine had access to the EU markets for now, and we know how some of the companies already driving quite a good results inside EU. We know like that before the full-scale invasion, our core importer of grain was China. Now, surprise, it's Spain. So basically, all those things are changing, and we do understand that we need to be better prepared for that. But one thing is enabling a lot of things on the Ukrainian side, both from the reforms and just like a trust building, but the access to the finances, that's a thing which can be done together with the partners. And I'm not only saying and talking and asking for the donations, but just the loans. The loans doesn't exist now in Ukraine, frankly speaking. When we're talking about the interest rates on the level of the 23%, I'm sorry, that's not an access to the finances. So that's a very pragmatic ask and pragmatic, desire to help all those entrepreneurs who are here in the country and trying to do their best.
Thank you. Being mindful of the time, as a closing wrap-up round for all our panelists, I would like to ask you to summarize your message to our lovely audience today in 1 or 2 sentences. What is the key message that you feel like you would like to transfer? Ms. Paul?
I mean, my message would be, if you want to continue to live securely in a democratic state, support Ukraine, push your governments and all other actors to continue to support Ukraine in humanitarian, military, whatever means, and also, of course, to support Ukraine's membership of both the EU and NATO, because this will mean that we're living in a Europe that is whole and free. This would be my main message.
Ms. Opalenko?
For my part, me as an evidence manager who organizes the process of collecting evidence and manage information flows, I would like to know that over the past 10 years, we have learned to document and to manage evidence perfectly, to withstand difficulties and work in full-scale war without electricity and in conditions of complete uncertainty. But this sporadic uncertainty and neutrality of partners against the background of the crisis that has arisen in the field of international humanitarian law, as I said before, and in fact in the life of the whole humanity, is much worse for us today. So we definitely need this help, and we need a strong position to chase the truth and to stand peace together.
Ms. Azarkhina?
Try to be short. So first of all, frankly speaking, we all need to accept the thought that we're already in the war altogether if we are trying to understand ourselves as a democratic world. And we need really to try our best, to try whatever is possible to make sure that we can win this war in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in a round of applause to our panelists.